Before we get started here, let me say that this video is extremely circuitous. That's fine, it was my intention to make it that way, and I do have my reasons. You might want to know these reasons, but they're mine and you can't have them. That being said, feel free to watch this a section at a time if you want. Binging it all at once will probably lead to worse retention of the main concepts, which means you just have to watch it again, and— Wait a second. Actually, I should probably encourage you to do that, to be honest. If I were any good at this YouTube thing, I would just—
Sit in the dark and ponder how one fit to make the bottom fall to the floor, and they all fall down. It goes, it goes, it goes, it goes, it goes, it goes.
Any discussion of Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy must start, as you've probably guessed, by considering Wallace Stevens' 1923 poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. Well, I'm being a little cheeky when I say that, so let me tell you what I really mean. I'm a guy who's read at least one or two books. When I play narrative games, I think about them in terms of short stories and novels, as well as where they necessarily differ because of their interactive medium. When I play games that are explicitly gamey, I tend to think overwhelmingly about their gaminess. When I played Getting Over It, I couldn't stop thinking about it like I think about poems. Wondering why that was the case while trying to beat my best time, I came across this line.
Have you thought about who you are in this? Are you the man in the pot, Diogenes? Are you his hand? Are you the top of his hammer? I think not. Where your hand moves, the hammer may not follow, nor the man, nor the man's hand. In this you're his will, his intent, the embodied resolve in his uphill ascent.
This question about who, where, and what you are when you play the game is a question about the player's perspective. Like many poems, Getting Over It has a primary interest in phenomenology, or the study of experience, consciousness, and perspectives. Modern poetry often employs the poetic image as a means of exploring phenomenology, although many poets wouldn't be caught dead saying it in these terms. In everyday speech, an image is more or less a representation of something that we can see, a photograph, a painting, X-ray, or so on. In poetry, the term image is a little more complicated. For the sake of this essay, we'll use Ezra Pound's definition of the poetic image as that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. This definition is probably too abstract, especially if you don't really read a lot of poems. To demonstrate what I mean, here's a link to Stevens' poem on the screen. Pause the video, read the poem, and come back. Okay, now that you probably haven't gone and read that poem, let me say this. As a whole, this poem remains enigmatic to me. For starters, what exactly is the blackbird in this poem? It doesn't act as a singular metaphor, nor does it serve one primary function throughout. The simplest answer is that the blackbird acts in the poem as a representation of ways in which the speaker perceives blackbirds at different times. It's right in the title. The slightly more lyrical answer that I prepared is that the blackbird acts as a hub through which the poem's different intellectual and emotional tensions run through. Activity and passivity, subject and object, interior and exterior, that which is static and that which changes. The bird is at once a bird itself and the projection of the speaker's momentary feelings and sensations. And for a visual example, a poetic image is a lot like this optical illusion. There are, whether or not you can see them all at once, 12 black dots on this grid, evenly spaced. They exist at all times in a fixed position, but how many do you see at any given time? 2? 4? Maybe some of these dots appear in the corner of your eye to be less opaque than others. Maybe, like me, your eyes shift around, drawn to the next black dot on the periphery of your vision. I read in both this optical illusion and in the poetic image a shared interest in phenomenology. So, what does any of this have to do with 2017's Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy? Short answer, there is no short answer. We'll get there when we get there. This is probably already apparent if you've been listening, but I'm not going to follow the Google Maps directions of Rhetoric 101 essay writing to arrive at a conclusion in a timely manner. No, we're going to take the scenic route. I'm going to attempt to examine the phenomenology of Foddy's game, which will require us to explore contemporary reactions to Getting Over It and why those reactions dominated the discourse surrounding the game. Before we do that, let me provide you with a little phenomenological roadmap, although you should expect less Rand McNally and more go 3 houses down, turn left at the dead tree, follow the gravel pathways until you cross the railroad tracks. If you see a blue trailer, you've gone too far.
Spread ego cross the block, spread ego cross the block, spread ego cross the block.
The ideas expressed in this essay are largely thanks to the works of Wolfgang Iser, particularly his book The Act of Reading and the chapters The Implied Reader and The Play of the Text from 2 of his other books. I'm going to give you a bunch of concepts here as quickly as possible because I didn't really want to write this essay in the language of phenomenological literary criticism, which you'll thank me for later, so consider this info dump an act of mercy. You can skip this part if you want without missing most of what I'm talking about, but this will provide a framework for the points I'm making and why the video is structured in such a bullshit way. That said, here's a list of important concepts in regards to the phenomenology of reading. First, we have Iser's concept of the implied or implicit reader. The implied reader is essentially the reader that the author of a text envisioned while crafting it. The implied reader is often addressed directly by the text, though not always. This concept relates to getting over it in ways so obvious that I don't need to explain it, just listen to the narration if you haven't. Next, we have the repertoire, which Iser describes as the familiar territory within a text. This can be defined as any extra-textual elements within or surrounding the text, like allusions to art, history, cultural practice, and so on. An example of this would be not only the inclusion of a HUD, but the general cultural expectation of a HUD and what it should contain in, say, a first-person shooter. This relates to what Iser calls the background and foreground structure of a text. Oversimply put, this is meant to describe the process by which different elements of the repertoire take prominence in a text at different times and the effects this has on the reader's interpretation. This process also creates tension with what Iser calls the theme and horizon structure, in which the theme is the perspective of the reader at any given time, and the horizon is made up of the reader's past perceptions and their future expectations. It works the same way as the background and foreground structure, but happens in the reader instead of the text itself. If this doesn't make sense now, it will if you keep watching, so don't worry about it. It's important to note here that Iser describes the relationship between text and reader as existing at 2 opposing poles, think North and South Pole, and that the resolution of some tension between these poles is where a text meaning comes from. Iser calls the meaning created from this interpretive process the aesthetic object. Next, we have blanks, negations, and negativity, which are all textual tools that can be employed in order to engage the reader. Blanks are textual elements that have been intentionally omitted. Film noir is a good example of this, since it often relies on incomplete perspectives to hide information from the viewer. Negations are contradictions within a text. Irony is a type of negation in that a statement's meaning is often opposed to the statement itself. Negativity is the result of blanks and negations and forms what Iser calls the unwritten base of the text. We might think of this as the connotations which assume a level of openness meant to keep the reader engaged. Finally, it should be noted that Iser's later writing considered literature a game played between the author and the reader through the text, and he identified 4 modes of play. Agon, a fight or contest which focuses on conflicting norms and values. Alea, a pattern of play based on chance and the unforeseeable, which is focused on defamiliarization. We'll talk about that later. Mimicry, a game focused on creation of illusions, either to maintain as perfect of an illusion as possible, or to create a looking glass by which the reader views society. And Illinks, a game in which the reader's positions are subverted, undercut, or carnivalized as they are played against each other. These modes of play often exist simultaneously within a text. Agon's conflicting norms and values might pair well with the subverted reader positions of Illinks, for instance. The goal of these games is either to create meaning, which Iser considers a return to the familiar, explore the unfamiliar, or simply to experience the pleasure of playing a game. To recap, author, text, and reader exist in tension with each other, and that tension is explored through the text's use of extra-textual elements and the reader's states of perception. The result of this tension is the creation of the aesthetic object. Thus, interpretation is essentially a game played between author and reader for the purpose of creating meaning, exploring the unfamiliar, or simply playing a game. Now, it's time to get over getting over it with Bennett Foddy, with Moiré. Okay, I lied just a little bit earlier, little fib. Quick postscript before we get to getting over it. I only expressed this implicitly in the essay, so I'll say it explicitly here. A reader's phenomenological experience of a text doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not only influenced by, but built up by the society in which that reader lives. Check out this chart that looks like something from Jordan Peterson's book, The Pillars of Eternity, or The Treachery of Images, or whatever it's called. One thing that Easter doesn't talk as much about is the sociological influences on the phenomenological experiences of readers. To understand how anyone reads a text, we kind of have to prod at the society in which they live and experience it. I ask, why do we read Getting Over It the way that we do? And spend the next 50 or so minutes prodding at that question with a stick like I found it dead on the side of the road. So, have fun.
If you're delusional, your call will be transferred to the mothership.
If you're at all familiar with Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, chances are it's because of videos like the ones you've just seen. Maybe you've seen people playing it on Twitch or other streaming sites. That way of experiencing the game probably isn't too far from what Foddy himself intended, according to an interview he did with Game Informer, as well as his thoughts on frustration in games, which you can find in the links above. There are many ways of seeing the game that have been lost in favor of one overbearing interpretation. That Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy is simply a rage game. This designation comes with some specific baggage and forces me to ask what a rage game is. A rage game is meant to incite a reaction in the audience, but not just any reaction. It wants the player to push past frustration to pure, raw anger. It wants to do this through the implementation of unfair controls, challenges, and surprises. Take the footage you're looking at now. Lunar Lander, like many well-known rage games, is a free online flash game with controls that are particularly unresponsive. There are only a few different controls in the game, but each one interacts with the other to make controlling the landing feel like bullshit, especially because you have very little leeway with how slowly you must be moving to successfully land. Another example of a rage game is the early 2000s flash game, The Impossible Quiz. In this game, the player is angered through two different mechanisms. First of all, there are a limited number of lives. Get 3 questions wrong and you have to start from the beginning. You have skips, but if you use any of them, you can't complete the last question, so the player essentially has to memorize the entire quiz of 110 questions. This is made more frustrating by the second mechanism the game employs to anger the player. A shifting set of rules including language games and lateral thinking, which sometimes requires you to literally think outside of the box. These changing rules too are complicated by the presence of bomb slides. When you see these, you'll have to figure out the often obscure solution for a slide in a matter of seconds or face an immediate game over. Other slides might simply feel like finding the solution in the intended way is a waste of time, like the slide written in Wingdings, which is much easier to solve through trial and error and memorization rather than translate it into English. Trust me on that. The process of beating the quiz then involves as much brute force memorization and bullheadedness as it does outside the box thinking. Finally, we might consider games like Gauntlet of Ire, which takes advantage of both controls that don't feel good to play with, and a changing set of rules and or presence of random events that can ruin a level. As well, the game berates you for poor performance, at times in ways that seem outlandishly non-sequitur and personal, like when the game tells you everyone you know is tired of hearing about your problems, if you've had a second chance you'd waste it again, or eventually you'll run out of things that make you a little happy. On one hand, the game's bullying of the player seems very self-consciously edgy, in line with the game's mean-spirited take on the genre of the rage game. It's a far cry from the friendly ribbing of Dark Souls' reminder that you died after you've been knocked off of a roof by someone with more time in the game than you spent doing any one thing in your life. On the other hand, the game's creator clearly understands how they want to respond to the implied reader of the game, and how to elicit reactions in them. What this amounts to is that Lunar Lander, The Impossible Quiz, and Gauntlet of Ire are designed to be not only difficult and punishing, but fundamentally unfair. They don't want to be beaten. They want the player to get mad, tell their friend about giving up, and create a sense of challenge and the social pressure to outperform their peers. While I don't think Getting Over It avoids any of these criteria all of the time, I do think that it doesn't adhere to these criteria well enough to qualify as a rage game in the way that we often think of it. Many reviews claim that the controls of Foddy's game are unfair, and it certainly does feel that way at times. However, it's a claim I'd like to examine here. Obviously, my own experience in this regard is tainted, as I've spent enough time with the game to have gotten over it in 6 minutes and 54 seconds, an unimpressive but respectable time, and therefore may have less of a clear memory of how it felt to attempt the Devil's Chimney for the first time. Instead, I'd like to point to a review on Celia Wagner's crit points here. Wagner lays out why she believes the controls are nuanced instead of unfair. According to Wagner, mastering the nuance of the controls requires the player to consider the velocity of two moving objects, the hammer and the pot, that are both influencing each other. As well, the player must account for two odd-shaped hitboxes as they come into contact with various objects, the trapezoidal Yosemite hammer and the round-sided flat-bottomed cauldron. The illusion of inconsistency is created by the oddness of these variables. However, the existence of sub-2-minute runs of the game are a testament to the predictability of the controls given enough time. What has been confused for inconsistency is actually unintuitiveness, a topic that we will discuss at length later. We might consider intent too, not as a final say on whether this is a rage game, but in regards to what Foddy means when he says, "I made this game for a certain kind of person, to hurt them." I don't doubt that this is true to some degree at face value, and I'd be lying if I said the game always felt good to play. During my first run, because I panicked and hadn't mastered pogoing, I unintentionally rode the snake all the way to the beginning after taking forever to get across those damn snowballs. I viscerally felt a sinking feeling in my stomach when this happened. I was disappointed and had to close my eyes for a moment and decide if I wanted to walk away. I chose not to, and having done most of the obstacles a number of times by that point, I was able to make it to the bucket again in far less time than it took me to get to Orange Hell for the first time. I was able to push through this initial frustration and put my progress with the game into perspective. More precisely, not only was I able to do this, if I wanted to beat the game, I had to do this. The decision to make the game one continuous level with no real checkpoints differs from most rage games I have much experience with. Many games notorious for raging at, or even just being difficult, have copious checkpoints and often require you to only get through several seconds of gameplay at a time without dying, and sometimes these games don't even allow you a starting point that gives you a chance to reflect, such as the boss level in Super Meat Boy where you have to outrun Brownie. It's easy to get so wrapped up in going fast that you fail to realize that calming down would help you more than anything else. Getting over it doesn't operate this way though. In getting over it, the player must sit with their mistakes. There are times where this feels awful, especially while mastering Orange Hell, but in my experience, the climb up always provided that context that I mentioned before. For me, this marked a difference between frustration and rage. I encourage you to look at Foddy's 11 flavors of frustration and consider how many of these types you've felt while playing Getting Over It. Reading the list for myself, it occurs to me that frustration encompasses a wide range of both positive and negative emotions that are essential to game design. Otherwise, why the hell would anyone play a battle royale? I would argue that, because the player must live with their mistakes, Getting Over It is less of a rage game and more of a hurt game. It asks the player to think about frustration and hurt and failure in a way that's not limited to rage, to explore the multifaceted nature of emotions that seem only negative at first. This could be one reason that the narration towards the end of the game aims for closeness both metaphorically and with the player's ear. Pushing through a negative experience can lead to a positive outcome. So, why did this message seem largely lost to the broader public? I have my own answer in the last part of this essay. I can only speak for what it's like in the United States, but long story short, I think that we view even temporary failure and embarrassment as an aberration. Finally, another criticism that's been levied against Getting Over It is that the supposed pretentiousness of the narration intends to evoke rage in the player who must listen as they attempt to climb. If you honestly believe that that's even the primary function of the narration, then I'm sorry to say that I don't think there's much worth saying in agreement or disagreement with this criticism. On a personal level, I'd say two things to the elabor of this rhetorical hand grenade. First, I'd tell them to stop throwing hand grenades. Secondly, I'd ask them how the game aims for some greater sense of importance than it's earned. However, any answer to this question, and any rebuttal I could come up with to this answer, would only be a fetid regurgitation of some part of the long-rotting carcasses of several video game discourses that were dead well before October 2017 when the game came out. This will be covered in part 6, where we'll discuss getting over it as a cog in what I like to call the discourse machine, a decentralized reiterator and reanimator of pointless conversations which deforests lively ecosystems of thought and replaces them with a monoculture dominated by a few species deemed robust or commercially useful enough to thrive. Before broadening the focus of this video, I want to narrow in on just what I think getting over it is if I don't think it's a rage game. While rage games are defined by some technical characteristics, they are primarily defined by the effect those characteristics are meant to have on the player. For that reason, it's not particularly informative about what type of game getting over it is and how we might situate it within a larger context of a genre of video games. If we were to define getting over it by its gameplay, it is undoubtedly a platformer. In some respects, this is somewhat obvious, but I think that it warrants some discussion if only for the fact that it's rarely discussed in depth as existing in the same genre as Celeste, Super Meat Boy, or Super Mario. If we condense the definition of platformer to account for all of its various subgenre, without also encompassing every other game with movement, don't worry rail shooters, you're safe from this fustercluck, we might say that a platformer is a game in which the primary purpose is to move a character to a specific goal, which requires the player to use their reflexes, spatial awareness, and knowledge of the game's mechanics. This is not a perfect definition by any means. It can technically be stretched to encompass cover shooters, for instance, but it will do the trick for our purposes here. To begin situating getting over it within the platforming genre, I'll reiterate the points made in Celia Wagner's article about the game. Getting over its physics takes some getting used to because they require the player to approach movement in a novel way, while also accounting for the movement and placement of two odd-shaped objects which have their own velocities and rotations. This stands in contrast to games like any of the Super Marios or Super Meat Boy, which generally have the player accounting for these factors for one object in space. And yet, each of these games requires a knowledge of unintuitive and sometimes frustrating mechanics in order to complete them. For instance, Mario's run in Super Mario 3 is described by Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit as like skating on ice. He also notes that Super Meat Boy feels alternately heavy and floaty depending on whether you're running or jumping. Particularly in Super Meat Boy, if you want those A+ ratings and band-aids, you're going to have to learn how to manage the shift key during your jump because the run function also affects the speed and trajectory of that jump. It allows you to perform amazingly daring jumps, but it's also hell to control at first. What makes Super Meat Boy an ultimately successful platformer is that, with practice, you gain control over your character. You do learn to manage the shift key and thread the needle or cross a chasm. And isn't the same true of getting over it? Take a look at this common skip that speedrunners do. Also, the only skip I can do. I can't always do this on my first try. I can't always do it on my 5th try anymore, but after flinging Diogenes around like a dog with a chew toy for a while, I'm able to consistently perform the skip. When I'm in practice, just about every other time. The presence of skips, speedruns, and techniques like pogoing are all indicators that, as with any other good platformer, mastering the variables that are given to you by the developers will allow you a level of control that allows you to predictably move your character. It's simply that the way you move your character and the variables at hand are not what you're used to. So, from the perspective of physics and movement, I think it's safe to say that some criticisms of getting over it fail not only when thinking of it as a rage game, but as a platformer as well. From a level design standpoint, I don't think Super Meat Boy or Super Mario are particularly useful points of comparison since they have many small levels. The same goes for Celeste with its large chapters that you move more or less freely through one screen at a time. Rather, I find value in comparing Getting Over It to a game with a very similar level structure but pretty much the opposite reputation. A Short Hike. Aesthetically, these games are opposites. A Short Hike is the embodiment of cozycore with lovingly designed assets, a very listenable soundtrack, and an overwhelmingly approachable atmosphere. This is in contrast to Getting Over Its Trash Mountain, its grating and imbalanced soundtrack of royalty-free music, and its difficult to approach opening section. However, if we look at the level design, they share one important similarity. In each game, the goal is to climb a mountain. Actually, that seems kind of spurious. I'm not going to get rid of this comparison, but I wonder if I can find a different angle. The real point of similarity between these two games is the openness of the level structure. The difference between these two games in that respect is the source of motivation for doing so. In a short hike, backtracking and searching is encouraged to gather feathers, meet characters, and generally have fun floating around this friendly little world. In Getting Over It, the motivation to explore and experiment comes solely from the player. There's a remarkable barrenness to Getting Over It's design. You have the player and you have the Mountain of Refuse. You moved your character in one extremely open-ended way. You have the chance to do anything possible within the game at any given point, if you have the ability and knowledge to do so. Outside of the time taken to complete the game, there's not much to quantify how well you're doing. There's not even a fail state, only your motivation to keep going or not. Even Super Meat Boy has unlockable characters that change the way the levels are approached. But in Getting Over It, power-ups are a sort of textual blank. There's only the player, their skill, and their curiosity, all three of which are necessary for mastering the game. This sets Getting Over It quite a bit apart from the mainstream platformers and platformers renowned for their difficulty like Kaizo Mario levels, which often must be completed in one specific and perfect way. To recap, Getting Over It has consistent physics that allow for skill-based gameplay and an open level structure in which the player may experiment with many ways of beating the game. So, what really sets it apart? In short, I think it's these criteria. 1. Variables that show skill are difficult to quantify, and intermediate skill still involves quite a bit of failure comparative to many platformers. 2. Opportunities to experiment or change your approach are not pointed out to the player. 3. The game cannot be perfectly executed, even when skillfully executed, like a Kaizo level. These factors add up to the fact that, when approaching more skillful play, the player must develop a sense of muscle memory and a sense of openness to changing their approach on the fly, since predictability occurs within a range of likely outcomes. Essentially, while Getting Over It is goal-oriented to a degree, enjoying it also requires the player to be open to the simple pleasure of playing with or without success. The high skill ceiling combined with the extremely flexible solutions is very much like Celeste if you've had the chance to really dig into both games. If that's the case, then, what accounts for the vastly different reactions to these games? My answer to this will come naturally after an anecdote and a long discussion of our history. It's time to talk about B games and more broadly about avant-garde art. In Getting Over It, Bennett Foddy provides a solid definition of a B game from a technical perspective. These technical considerations are foundational to making a B game in the same way we might think of B movies. These are passion projects often made cheaply or at a loss, primarily because of the creator's love of the medium. To put B media and the avant-garde into a larger perspective though, I'll start by relating two experiences I've had with music. The first experience is my introduction to Daniel Johnston. I don't remember the first time I heard Daniel Johnston. Years later, I would realize that the songs I heard were To Go Home and Deviltown. That I forgot this experience is important because it was a failure of mine as a human being, for a reason that we'll talk about later. I remember who I was with at the time, a guy who introduced me to seminal American weirdos like Hunter S. Thompson, William S. Burroughs, and Tom Waits. I considered myself down with these figures in a way. Frank's Wild Years and Rain Dogs were cool albums, and The Naked Lunch was a book that most people's parents would throw away if they knew what was in it. It was full of dope and cum and shape-shifting creatures, you know? I was drawn to their seemingly rough edges, their failure to fit into the norms of the times they lived in. I was even willing to look past the incident where Burroughs got away with killing his wife in Mexico. I still believe there's something special about A Junkie's Christmas, although I do always bring up the caveat about him killing his wife in Mexico when I talk about it now. But none of these weirdos really prepare you for Daniel Johnston. His songs were pop songs, done in a way that no pop artist would ever do them. His lyrics were often earnest to the point of cliché. It's not a rejection of pop culture, but an idiosyncratic embrace of it. Behind Johnston's distorted yelling voice, the floppy tempo of his recordings, the unnerving obsession with true love and old crushes, is the scaffolding that pop music had built itself around since the 50s and 60s. Hell, if you listen to M. Ward's version of To Go Home, you'd think it a natural part of any oversoft folksy boys record collection in the mid-2000s. And it was. That I didn't remember my introduction to Johnston's music is unsurprising if you're unfortunate enough to have known me before I was 28 years old. I can tell you that I heard his scratchy voice, the simple chords and melodies, the largely unmixed audio, the out-of-tune instruments and out-of-key voices, and came to one conclusion. Man, this guy really doesn't know how to play. Johnston is not a great musician, but For that to be the extent of my engagement was a failure of intellectual curiosity so great that, if I'm ever guilty of it again, someone should take my keyboard so I can never share my thoughts with the public afterwards. It's also the conclusion most people will come to about Daniel Johnston. The second experience starts with the last time I would see any member of a specific friend group from high school during my first semester of college. We were hanging out in a shed that had been converted into what could have been a guest room in a backyard with an in-ground swimming pool where surprisingly nobody was doing drugs. It seemed cool in the sense that the guest house qualities like the presence of a daybed, chairs, and electricity clashed with the shed qualities like exposed particle board and a lack of heating. As a whole, we were listening to music and talking about what we'd been up to since the last time we hung out. As an individual, I was mostly listening to the music, to be honest. I was probably thinking about an essay I wanted to write for one of my English classes about how the first Saw movie uses Jigsaw's flawed reasoning to encourage the viewer to question their own notions of who deserves to be punished, while the second Saw movie sort of settles into the same lazy tropes of slasher movies that encourage the audience to rest assured that those dead people probably had it coming. And I did write that essay, although I doubt it was any good. The point is, there's a reason it was the last time I saw these people both on my end and theirs. Anyway, I was bored, but I stuck around because I didn't dislike these people. Then, the older brother of the guy whose parents owned the shed walked in. He took the aux cord, put on some music none of us knew, and asked me if I'd ever heard of Sealand. I told him I hadn't. He proceeded to talk at length about the potential for cities and open oceans to act as prototypes from which we could model new societies. The older brother was, to me, an enigmatic figure. In my under-traveled, underdeveloped, middle-class, and Midwestern brain, he was a person who had been places and seen things. While I spent my high school years smoking too much pot and not practicing enough for marching band or booking shows in the non-marching bands I was in, he'd been in the Navy, then college, then, well, I actually don't know, but there he was in the shed, saying things that were intriguing and didn't make much sense to me when the song Pink Noise by X Models came on. The introduction to that song is roughly 1 minute of a guitar playing quarter notes of the same gnarly interval run through a ring modulator. It's half as long as the rest of the song. This sparked a discussion with one other guy who was there. He thought the introduction was a waste of time, in part because anybody could play it on guitar. Both the older brother and I took issue with this in ways less articulate than what I present here. First of all, if you've ever known guitarists who aren't avid Steve Albini worshippers, you'd know that if the average guitar player was put into a Saw movie and just had to play along with a metronome, their head would get exploded by some ridiculous device, in this case, a literary one. Secondly, those quarter notes I mentioned earlier are recontextualized as dotted quarter notes when the drums and vocals come in, a technique that wouldn't disorient the listener nearly as effectively if they hadn't settled into their initial interpretation of the note and possibly started to think about what might happen next in the song. Primed as we were for a discussion on talent and musicality, we were bombarded with this drum beat. Full Moon by Death Grips. I have no idea what we said after this song came on. I couldn't get it out of my head. The drums to this song are undeniably two things: an assault on the senses and the product of an intimate knowledge of percussion instruments. More than any of the music I liked at the time, like the Mars Volta, Death Grips was immediately unapproachable. The opening track of the Mars Volta's Bedlam and Goliath might start with an auditory punch to the nose, but it was a familiar one, wrapped in the boxing glove of being immediately recognizable as talented musicianship. This same glove was not present when I heard Full Moon for the first time. To an untrained ear, it sounds like someone tripping over a drum set on the other end of a phone line. It takes the stance of enjoy the noise or learn enough to recognize the music, otherwise get lost. It's a beautiful stance for art to take. It's, in some ways, a necessary stance for art to take at times. In his 1980 book, The Act of Reading, Wolfgang Iser discusses a tension between the classical modes of literary interpretation that focused on finding the meaning in a work of art, and the art that had been produced from the end of the 19th century until the present day. As Iser puts it, the critic, working with unstinting philological pains, never gives up his attempt to find a meaning that is precisely formulated on the printed page. At the same time, Iser states that modern literary works are so full of apparent inconsistencies not because they are badly constructed, but because such breaks act as a hindrance to comprehension and so force us to reject our habitual orientations as inadequate. Before moving on, I have to describe as briefly as I can a few terms for similar concepts that will be useful for thinking about avant-garde art and B-games from here on out. The first term is defamiliarization from Victor Shklovsky's Art as Device. In Shklovsky's words, to defamiliarize an image is to make the stone stony, to create the sensation of seeing and not merely recognizing things. That is, to describe or present an unfamiliar image of something the reader likely takes for granted in order to bring them closer to that thing. You take for granted the quarter notes of X Model's Pink Noise only for them to be recontextualized. Similar to this is Bertolt Brecht's Verfremdungseffekt, or alienation effect as it's often translated. Rather than bringing the viewer closer to the everyday, Brecht wanted actors to eschew acting that played into the expectations of emotional realism that audiences of the time expected, with the goal of denying the audience their immediate emotional reactions and forcing them instead to ask more critical questions about their experiences. In each case, the reader or viewer is pushed towards a greater distance from what they know and are meant to see familiar things in a new light. Defamiliarization is relatively easy to see in getting over it. How many games have you played where learning to move around at all, much less gracefully, is one of the primary challenges? Verfremdungseffekt we might consider in the overwhelming gaminess of Foddy's game. The environment itself is made up of pre-made assets that don't fit together. Your character is a stock Unity asset. This can be off-putting and resists the emotional shortcuts that many good games, like The Last of Us, take great advantage of. Both of these techniques fall under the category of what critic and philosopher Herbert Marcuse would call negative thought, or thought that goes against the prevailing ideas and norms of an advanced industrial society. This differs from Esser's negativity mentioned earlier, primarily in the sense that Marcuse's concept of negative thought was applied to society at large, while Esser's concept of negativity is concerned with the individual reader. Marcuse believed that negative thought could be accomplished in art through two avenues: the avant-garde, which is an intentional rejection of contemporary ideals, and pop art that recreates those ideals divorced from their initial context and repurposes them in a way that's not deemed proper. Now, I'm going to keep this conversation about art instead of politics for now, so in order to clarify what terms like defamiliarization and Verfremdungseffekt and negative thought mean, I will return to the topic of this video, which is video games? Psych! We're talking about Duchamp now, Duchamp! Duchamp's sculpture, Fountain, illustrates the tension between classical and contemporary literary interpretation and the methods that create this tension quite well. Although, like Getting Over It, the sculpture is now part of a dead and reanimated discourse about what art is. If the critic approaches the work with the goal of finding meaning using the text alone, they'll likely be disappointed. I can't blame anyone for their initial reaction to the sculpture. To describe the text, the sculpture is a white Bedfordshire model porcelain urinal purchased by Duchamp from an ironworks in New York City in 1917. The urinal has been reoriented so that the drain faces outward instead of downward. It has been signed R. Mutt, 1917. On its surface, it shares with abstract art an apparent lack of content, although it's not abstract art. Any meaningful interpretation of Duchamp's Fountain requires the viewer to think off the page, so to speak, about what they're seeing, to consider critically the defamiliarized urinal. The bulk of the sculpture is a white porcelain Bedfordshire urinal, which itself comes with many connotations. It is a familiar, mass-produced item. It is also a repository for bodily waste. Both mass-produced items and bodily waste are part of our everyday experiences. We either fail to or choose not to think about them most of the time, and we may confuse this with the idea that there's nothing more to them. When you focus intently on the urinal, you'll likely have to remember the unfortunate fact that it's a piss trough. The name signed on the urinal, notably not Marcel Duchamp, is significant only if we consider the specific cultural moment the statue was produced in. Mutt is, according to Duchamp and contemporary art critics, a nod to Mutt and Jeff, a popular comic strip of the time. R is short for Richard, which has the double meaning in French as a slang term for moneybags. There is here a connotation of bourgeois luxury, moneybags, and something mass-produced and disposable, a popular comic strip. It's a sculpture which gains meaning from the negation of text in the favor of context. As avant-garde art, it repurposes mass-produced or popular subject matter in an attempt to force us to consider it. I've mentioned defamiliarization, but Verfremdungseffekt is also at play here, since the viewer will likely have the best time with the sculpture if they have their initial reaction to it, step back, and consider both the sculpture and their reaction. Now that I've talked about the modern art discourse sculpture, it's time to actually talk about video games in the video game zone. Sexy hiking is a video game. Sexy hiking feels silly to play and downright stupid to say out loud. Sexy hiking is a B game. Sexy hiking's title screen looks like it was scrawled in MS Paint in a few minutes, with music like someone who was trying to remember the X-Files theme. Our character is a strange armless goblin whose disembodied hands swing a hammer using controls that are as agonizingly unresponsive as they are excitingly novel. The sound mixing is abrasive, the music and sound effects horrifically loud and unpleasant to listen to. It's quite easy to clip through the floor, which means you'll have to start the level over. My guess would be that Jazzuo knew that pretty much every element of this game was to some degree unpleasant. Sexy hiking doesn't care if you beat it or even play it, because, well, sexy hiking is a B game. In an alternate reality where I've run into sexy hiking before getting over it, the controls, the lack of options or directions, the unpleasantness all work to alienate me from the usual experience of playing video games. The normal joys of playing platformers are gone as the movement is defamiliarized, the arbitrariness of any goals the game gives me thrown in my face as I swing my hammer, launching myself at first, I think, towards the ugly rotating head in the sky that marks my salvation until I hit some unforeseen obstacle that puts me at the start of the level. Still, sexy hiking can be categorized easily among the various contemporary free flash games on the internet which, despite what I've shown you in this video, were often trying to create unquestionably fun experiences that were simply built on ideas that were too small or too distasteful to be developed into whole games. Getting Over It is not a B game. It's an avant-garde game, primarily because it expands on the ideas expressed intentionally or not in a B game, and places those ideas on a mainstream platform like Steam. Daniel Johnston's recordings were, for a long time, hard to come across. His early albums were found on tapes that he would record at the request of anyone who wanted one, performing the whole album each time. Jazzuo's sexy hiking was, and is, something that you must find for yourself and extract from a zip folder yourself, and learn to boot up for yourself in a way that is more intimate and intentional than any experience Steam can offer you. You don't have to spend money to play sexy hiking, but you have to want to play it. Getting Over Its presence on Steam, and Sexy Hiking's presence elsewhere, is like the difference between Duchamp's fountain sitting in an art gallery and an alternate reality where someone who is not Duchamp erected the sculpture in their backyard with an identical set of values and presuppositions. It would be perceived not as high art, but the ramblings of a madman. At best, it would be a point of pilgrimage for people who fetishize the personas of people like Hunter S. Thompson and William S. Burroughs without sufficiently engaging with and criticizing their work. Where I believe sexy hiking to be a pure diversion, taking part in the playful flash games of its time that were popular and common in the early 2000s, I believe that Getting Over It intentionally calls this to mind to comment on the state of gaming circa 2017. If I talk too much about the game's narration, I feel like it would be too easy to make this point. It'd be so familiar that you'd fail to see the arguments for what they are, and instead focus on the arguments that you've already seen before. If you want to watch the game's narration, there's plenty of videos of it, or you could read the whole thing online. It's not bad. Instead, I'll say that by 2017 there was more or less a codified language of mechanics and inputs in platforming games outside of a few oddball games like Viva or Snake Pass, which I really need to play. If you're playing a platformer, you've got sprints, dashes, double jumps, super jumps, blooper jumps, rolls, coyote times, power-ups, baddie stomps, collectathons, checkpoints, skill checks, stop blocks, and hard bops. You'll likely experience all of this without touching your mouse, or at the least primarily using your WASD or arrow keys, shift key, spacebar, and probably a couple flourishes akin to English dialects. If a game was speaking this language, you knew it was a good game. Getting Over It did not speak this language. Instead, Getting Over It said, hey, this modern English you have is pretty cool, but I also like its strange Germanic roots, and those roots are fucked up physics. I referred to my initial reaction to Daniel Johnston as a personal failure, and I believe this, primarily because I've always considered myself a curious person. But any sufficiently curious person can appreciate Death Grips. Their relationship with their own music would be a decade-long attempt to wriggle out of the vice of their own image built by early recordings and a record deal with Epic that would result in the band creating vastly different albums. Their first EP, Ex-Military, as wild and abrasive as it was also able to be subsumed by the public's preconceptions about rap, race, urban life, and nihilism, particularly a middle-class white suburban public. Any self-styled weirdo who likes weird things can appreciate the edginess of Ride's lyrics in Guillotine or Spread Eagle Across the Block. or the iconic 10-9-8-7-6-6-5 fork tongue that kicks off Tachyon. And if we look at the comments and reviews about Ex-Military, it's easy to see that the contents of the album were easily categorized by a segment of the public as black experience equals other, rather than self equals other or society equals other. The popular conception of the album can be reduced to, wow, a black band is yelling at me, and from this, the band got picked up by Epic Records to record a couple albums until they released their third album, No Love Deep Web, without the record company's permission. Daniel Johnston, unlike the more well-connected Ride and Hill, was a severely bipolar man who would spend years in and out of mental institutions and live most of his adult life with his family working part-time jobs. He did not have a Tom Waits or Ride persona. He got a record deal in part because Kurt Cobain wore a shirt that referenced him. That deal was cut by the company after one album. He did not work with a niche famous drummer like Zach Hill with an enthusiastic fan base. These signifiers of cultural placement are what create a real difference between B-media and avant-garde media. Within American culture, Johnson represents what we might call cringe today, rather unfairly might I add. Years later, I would listen to Deviltown and To Go Home Again, this time trying to meet the work in its own terms. Looking past my initial biases about the musicianship, I have to admit that if I listen to Johnston's To Go Home, it blows M-words out of the water. There's a brittleness to Johnston's voice and an irreplaceable quality to the recording of the song's limited instrumentation that is simply lost by being placed in Ward's wonderful, clean, and proper indie pop. I would find Johnston's music alternately grating and touching, but more than that, I would find it worth thinking about with openness and compassion.
I make the money, man. I roll the nickels. The game's mine. I deal the cards.
According to Marcuse, there's a couple things that wind up happening to art that contains negative thought or goes against the social norms. One that applies to outsider art is obvious. It gets cast aside, largely forgotten outside of harmless circles of dweebs. This is more or less what happened to Daniel Johnston's music. Unless you're a musician, you likely haven't heard of it or wouldn't want to hear it again. The other thing that happens is something that Marcuse calls repressive desublimation. Desublimation is what happens when successful art that was avant-garde is welcomed into the commercially viable embrace of mainstream society and incorporated into what Marcuse calls positive thought. If negative thought is meant to challenge the established beliefs of an advanced technological society, then we can assume that positive thought is meant to uphold those beliefs. Chief among those beliefs is philosophical positivism, which does away with any meaningful discussion of theism or metaphysics under the belief that rational and empirical verification is necessary for any claim to be justifiable. Now, you might be thinking, damn, that sounds pretty good. I mean, I have air conditioning and talkies. But neither Marcuse nor I are claiming that positive thought or positivism is inherently bad. Rather, any support for negative thought comes not from a denial of rationality, but a recognition that the rational and irrational are both necessary for a society to maintain a healthy intellectualism and refuse authoritarianism. A rationality that will not let itself be challenged crosses the line from scientific and philosophical inquiry to belief. The overarching positive thought that Marcuse challenges in his book One-Dimensional Man is the prevalence of consumerism in advanced technological societies. Marcuse sees consumerism as a means of social control through the establishment of what he calls false needs. These needs grease the wheels of capitalist production by increasing the cost of living and thus the necessity to work. This in turn creates more consumer items which need to be purchased, which increases the cost of living, and so on. Recreation is rife with false needs. Even backpacking, which is just walking through the woods, requires the use of a car, and oh my god, have you seen the price of backpacking gear? Two of my hobbies, gaming and guitar, create a plethora of costly false needs that are taken for granted by people who partake in those hobbies. Guitar players like their stomp boxes and fragile vintage amp tubes, gamers their fast graphics and gamer chairs. A good concrete example of how false needs influence games themselves is the growth of live service games. They make a ton of money, which draws investors. They're also incredibly expensive to make, which means they need to be consistently monetized in as many ways as possible. The end result is games that are often fun, but suffer from systemic bloat both in the gameplay and in the inclusion of things like gambling and multiple in-game currencies that don't interact with each other. I'll say right now that not all increases in the cost of living due to modern technology are bad. Cars should have firewalls and other safety features that make them more expensive. The same goes for Holmes. To bring this back to music, I've already said that Daniel Johnston couldn't really be folded into the consumerist music industry too well. By the time he got clocked by it, there was already so many bootlegs of his recordings and merch, and his community was pretty dedicated to sharing his stuff that it wasn't profitable. Death Grips, though, had to actively struggle against being folded into the mainstream, which, if that's not what they were doing, they could have fooled me. Their first real album, The Money Store, released on the Epic record label and produced by L.A. Reid, and their double album, The Powers That Be, released on Third World's label in the US and Harvest in the UK, charted on various top music charts. The Powers That Be, despite the fact that, in its first half, most of the music consists of Hill playing an electric drum set on which the pads were all programmed to play samples of Bjork's vocals. In writing this section of the video, I'm reminded of the Dirtbag Nation section of Tim Rogers' review of Doom, which covers the commercialization of violence, rebellion, and distrust of authority during the late 80s and early 90s. Death Grips drummer Zach Hill, before forming the group with Ride, was a founding member of the band Hella, a quintessential butthead math rock band of the early 2000s, and had worked with artists like Nick Reinhardt of Terra Mellos. He did ads for Vans shoes. Death Grips hung out with Robert Pattinson. Hill was a rock star in the niche of countercultural bands that thrived off the very commercialization that Rogers talks about. Math and noise rock has come a long way toward the mainstream since bands like Colossomite, Deerhoof, US Maple, Melt Banana, and Daughters first released albums. Math rock especially has been codified comfortably into a genre full of bands like Chan, who, while very talented, wouldn't be all that out of place as background music in a somewhat trendy shop or a pretty cool elevator. It's somewhat engaging and very easy to listen to. Let it be known, by the way, that this isn't a critique of Hill or Ride. It's not even a critique of Chan. I'm not accusing either of being like a scheming rich person who set out to undermine countercultural or only cares about the size of their audience. I believe that everything they do is very genuine to their artistic aims. The critiques I level aren't at Death Grips, but the society in which Death Grips must operate. Get your bag, piss off L.A. Reid, it's all good. But the conclusion I've been coming to since I mentioned my initial reactions to Death Grips' music is that the band was pre-desublimated. The thing about genuine counterculture is, to put it in Bennett Foddy's words, things are made to be consumed and used in a certain context, and once the moment is gone, they transform into garbage. In the context of technology, those moments pass by in seconds. The music's continued existence puts it on a path towards repressive desublimation, commercialization, and normalization. Death Grips was desublimated by the time middle-class Americans had heard NWA and DMX, and codified the material by these bands in such a way as to present the cultural image of the hard black man. For many, ex-military could have been stretched into this mold. Further, blending elements of punk, noise, and breakbeat into their sound did little to change this. I should say that this isn't an image that Death Grips tried to ignore or avoid, really. It's just that many reviews and reactions to the album contemporary to its release failed to recognize what the mixtape was doing with that cultural image. Without ignoring where that image comes from and why, they had fun with it. They deploy humor in a similar way to bands like Cattle Decapitation and The Locusts. To fail to hear that humor in Ride's Charles Manson and Anton LaVey-inspired lyrics, to fail to think about the album's use of carnivalistic absurdism against a very real backdrop of contemporary paranoia, is to fail to hear the mixtape at all. Other ways in which Death Grips has approached the edges of American culture have had similar fates. I've Seen Footage stems from a conversation Hill had with someone from the neighborhood where he and Ride lived at the time. The refrain, "I've seen footage, I stay noited," has become for many fans of the band more or less a meme, as has much of the more bombastic material released by the band. The memification of Death Grips over time represents another desublimating process by which the contents of the band's material is concentrated into a slurry of ritualized self-reference. It's not a result of anything Death Grips themselves have done, only something that happens much more quickly given the technological ability for it to happen. Getting over it may be slightly different here because it was designed as a streaming game. It was meant to be reacted to, even if Foddy didn't think it would get the attention that it did. In that sense, I don't think that Foddy's game aims for some rejection of the effects of Web 2.0 more broadly and streaming specifically on cultural production, not even when he calls it trash culture. Rather, the game is simply a mechanism by which we might explore that effect. That being said, I do believe that even this effort was desublimated just like Death Grips was. Both were extruded into pre-existing molds so that they could fit comfortably into the conversations people were already having without fundamentally changing. One way of understanding this comes from Rem Koolhaas's manifesto Junk Space. To define junk space succinctly is impossible. Koolhaas certainly doesn't do it. I might say junk space is not a space at all, but the byproduct of cultural and material accumulation as modernization marches on. Koolhaas himself writes, "The only legitimate discourse is loss. Art replenishes junk space in direct proportion to its own morbidity. We used to renew what was depleted, now we try to resurrect what is gone. Junk space has to exaggerate its claims to the authentic. Junk space is like a womb that organizes the transition of endless quantities of the real, stone, trees, goods, daylight, people, into the unreal. The cosmetic is the new cosmic." If you've been listening, you'll see how Death Grips and Daniel Johnston are subject to all of this. Endless reproduction, memification, cosmetification. They have been ground and extruded into their necessary shapes. Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy is subject to the same process. It has been junkified, was possibly made to be junkified on YouTube and Twitch, Web 2.0, the preeminent creator of junk space, or what I like to call the discourse machine.
I close my eyes and seize it. I clench my fists and beat it. I light my torch and burn it. I am the beast I worship.
Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy was released on October 6, 2017, 8 days after Cuphead and 2,207 days after Dark Souls. In the 2,207 days between the release of Dark Souls and Getting Over It, one topic would come to be a lightning rod for culture war bullshit in gaming. Titties. Sorry, that's not what I was gonna say. Look, the writer who put that in the script has been disappeared. Don't worry about it. No one will see them again. The real answer is difficulty in video games. Since Dark Souls came out, it's been ubiquitous in discussions of difficulty, and difficulty has been ubiquitous in discussions of Dark Souls, to the point that it wasn't uncommon for difficulty to be the main draw of Souls-like games for quite some time, or, if you wanted to flex, the absence of difficulty. Whether or not that was the intention of the developers is beside the point. If you skip the section on Phenomenology earlier, I'll point out that Easter considers meaning construction a negotiation between the author, text, and reader. Stanley Fish, another literary critic, provides us with another concept that is useful here. Fish popularized the concept of interpretive communities in his oft-revised essay Interpreting the Vorarium. According to Fish, interpretive communities are made up of those who share interpretive strategies not for reading but for writing text, for constructing their properties and assigning their intentions. In other words, these strategies exist prior to the act of reading and therefore determine the shape of what is read rather than, as is usually assumed, the other way around. To consider Fish's words here, we might think about how games journalists and the gaming public were primed towards this reading. It doesn't come from the text alone. Dark Souls was difficult, especially in the days before it defined its own genre of games, but it was a lot of things: playful, whimsical, wistful, foreboding, enraging, mysterious, and so on. What's more, its difficulty is not uniform throughout the game. The player may find that, once they've mastered parrying and gotten their stats appropriately leveled, the only things that still give them trouble are those universally considered a pain in the ass. The gaming public and games journalists were primed to focus on the difficulty reading for one big reason. These groups are made up of gamers. Shocking, I know. But prizing difficulty and precise execution isn't new to Dark Souls. Ninja Gaiden and Contra, without the Konami code, you nerds, had kids with too much time on their hands hootin' and hollerin' at any progress they made that pushed them further than they'd previously been. Devil May Cry 3 made you feel like a total badass in the opening scene, only to get absolutely destroyed by Cerberus, the first boss you fight, a decision that was made in part because fans thought Devil May Cry 2 was too easy, which it was. I was going to capture footage of that game to show off how often you can just stand around and shoot things, but I don't want to play it. This is because many video games hold the same appeal that sports do to a large swath of the public. It kicks ass to see a quarterback throw a pass that threads the needle between defenders and lands safely in the hands of a wide receiver, or to see an outfielder make a diving catch for a baseball. It definitely kicks ass to see gymnasts flip around and do whatever it is they do, and if you lift weights, it kicks ass to watch the snatch and the clean and jerk. Similarly, it's impressive to watch somebody combo a whole room of enemies in DMC without letting the counter stop, do a no-hit run of Hollow Knight, or speedrun Getting Over It. We like difficulty because we like watching people do cool shit or doing cool shit ourselves. Skillful anything is, I would argue, inherently interesting in American culture, so skill becomes prized, especially in a mediascape where so much focus is put on being perceived through Twitch and YouTube. I'm not going to deny that I salivate at a clean squad wipe in Apex Legends, even if I know I'm contributing in my own small way to maintaining that public perception that I also urge us to be aware of and critical of. It's official. I'm a hypocrite. At the time it came out, though, skill in Dark Souls looked different than what many people expected. It was slow and methodical, and came from an understanding of game systems that showed you knew how to exploit the finer details of mechanics from iframes to convoluted leveling systems. You watch someone one-shot a boss the size of a house, think it looks cool, download the game, and almost immediately get stomped on by the Asylum Demon. Unless you cheese it by using black bombs, which I did because I'm a coward and wanted the demon's great hammer even though I wound up not building correctly to even use it. So, Dark Souls got a less flashy difficulty into the mainstream, and people were ready to reconsider difficulty in games. Obviously, there were difficult strategy games and CRPGs and such, but those will never have the appeal of an action game and thus form their own interpretive communities. Because Dark Souls required rethinking difficulty for many players who were unfamiliar with FromSoft games at the time, which was pretty much everyone, and because algorithms dictate how conversations form in Web 2.0, difficulty became the name of the game for a long time when discussing Dark Souls or referencing it in relation to other games. The Discourse machine had extruded Dark Souls into a difficulty-shaped block that could be inserted into any rhetorical structure that found use for it. It became a reference point and a meme. The Dark Souls of X was not an uncommon phrase. The concept of difficulty itself became a sort of bludgeon as the Souls series went on, and as the internet as we know it today was formed. Discussions on accessibility became discussions about difficulty. Discussions about games reviews became discussions about difficulty via a journalist's perceived inability to play difficult games at an acceptable level to be able to review them. Dean Takahashi's Cuphead gameplay became a rallying point for complaining about game journalists. Takahashi himself has actually maintained a fairly good sense of humor about the whole event, regardless of the frankly ridiculous discourse that sprang from it, especially considering his primary job as a journalist isn't game reviews but gaming tech news. Gamergate was also happening around this time, and I don't have much to say about Gamergate in reference to getting over it, other than, outside of its supposed concern about journalistic practices in games media, there was a clear interest from many involved to also determine which games were good, and this often meant games that were conventionally good or made fairly subtle changes to how games function. That in itself is not a surprising position to take. What we are familiar with, we are often open to. The idea of good games, though, was also wrapped up with difficulty. A good game, on top of controlling smoothly and being aesthetically pleasing, must be challenging, preferably with fail states and win states. A good game was generally an opponent to be conquered or contained many opponents to be conquered in a way that was immediately pleasing to the player. I am, to be fair, a little bit of a game anarchist in that I consider many things to fall under the definition of game and play that others may not. Ether considers textual interpretation itself a game, which would encompass games like Dear Esther and What Remains of Edith Finch. Many clicker games, too, cannot be lost or won, or winning them is a matter of sticking it out and waiting. The point of playing a clicker game isn't necessarily to win, as much as it is to explore the idea of endless growth, which is how we wind up with games like Universal Paperclip. So this was the stage that was set for the release of Getting Over It. Difficulty was one of, if not the, preeminent conversation in gaming. Getting Over It was recognized as difficult, and so any conversation about the game centered around this. However, as we discussed earlier, it didn't have the other elements of a good game going for it. The controls were wacky, and it was ugly as sin to look at. There was no real fail state except simply not returning. The only thing to conquer in the text itself was a mountain of garbage that defied all reason. What's worse, there was a narrator who actively talked about video games and, according to many, wouldn't shut up. As an unimportant side note, I find this complaint funny because even counting quotes and quips, there's probably like 20 minutes of narration, and I can assure you the average person making this claim spent much longer than that getting through the game. Foddy's narration may seem pretentious and contentious if we consider his game in the dominant sense of whether or not it's good. You might ask, why is this Australian guy interrupting my game to give me his ponderous thoughts about some Flash game that he ripped off? Sometimes this is meant to rid the player for failure, sometimes to commiserate or congratulate, sometimes to draw their attention to something larger. In this sense, the text makes use of what Easter calls negations or contradictions within the text itself. At times, falling down the mountain to the tune of going down the road feeling bad makes the player feel like the butt of the joke. Still, I don't think Foddy is insincere when, at the radio tower, he tells you that you've learned to hike and thanks you for playing to the end. And yet, the difficulty discourse machine, which also contains the accessibility discourse machine and the good art discourse machine, disallows a nuanced discussion as to the purpose of the narration, the defamiliarization of movement in platformers, or other elements of Foddy's text. And so these elements were shucked in preparation for the extrusion process, forming the game into a mold that was much more accessible for streaming and marketing. The extent to which the game had potential for negative thought was largely erased, leaving only the game's most basic textual elements, and in a game that relies on blanks and negations, what we wind up with is half a game. In this case, the positive half, the knowable, explainable, and consumable half. I don't want to leave us on a bummer, so I won't. See, while I've been going on about discourse machines and such, it doesn't negate the fact that individual readers do have their own agency, and readers from different interpretive communities can comfortably have different readings of a text that are still supported. Negative thought cannot be eradicated, only desublimated. So, I'll give my brief reading of the text itself. In short, it fucking rocks. In earnest, I was pleasantly surprised when I picked up the game in 2021. I had mostly been playing competitive FPS games and had, over time, come to view gaming dominantly as a mode of self-proving and opponent domination. I told you I salivated at seeing a clean squad wipe in Apex Legends, but I'm not legally allowed to tell you what it's like to do it yourself if you haven't. It was easy to continue playing long into the night, even when I had to be up early, and I'd do it for one more dopamine hit. My repertoire at the time then had Conquest and Dopamine in the foreground, and I've gotta be honest, that wasn't the best way for me to approach gaming or living. So I pick up getting over it, figuring it's been long enough since I've heard about it that I might approach it in a fresh way, and I was doing an FPS detox because, as I stated in my Hades video, I have some addictive tendencies. Without looking at the options, I hit new game and proceeded to flop around for my first couple hours of playing. In the back of my mind, I knew what not to do. I'd watched a bit of Markiplier playing through it and some speedruns back in 2017, so getting over the tree wasn't bad. Then, I had to get on the oar at the bottom of the ravine. Already, I found myself not entirely sure what to do until I remembered that pogoing was a thing. Eventually, I made my way up to the Devil's Chimney, which wasn't terrible, but I was a little cross about the slippery iron beam, if I'm going to be honest. It's just so slippery. I didn't have a firm grasp on the controls yet, so getting up the Devil's Chimney involved a lot of extra movement, to say the least, and in one of these careless movements I managed to fling myself in the wrong direction all the way to the bottom of the ravine, where Diogenes sat stupidly with his hammer in the same position it had been in when I threw him off a cliff. Going down the road feeling bad started playing the bouncy guitar and harmonica at odds with the lyrics. It was then I realized how important humor was to the player. Having watched people stream and having played the game quite a bit myself, I can say that in my experience it's actually much more important to the player than the audience. See, there's some humor in seeing others fail at the game, but none of that prepares you for how funny it can be when you fail, especially if you're in a headspace where failure is expected. And it was hilarious to me at the same time that it was a little annoying. In this sense, the game makes fantastic use of being, well, a game that the user experiences. But in order to achieve that effect, the reader must have a certain level of openness to new experiences while playing the game. The open player is constantly rewarded while playing Foddy's game. As stated earlier, you aren't encouraged or required to do much in the game. Instead, you're in a surreal playground full of items that might entice you to interact with them in different ways. When you get to the umbrella slide, for instance, you might take the most obvious way at first, but you may eventually realize that if you have momentum, you can throw yourself up to the rake from the umbrella and then launch yourself pretty much right onto the boxes with careful hammer placement. This is, of course, more difficult and riskier, but it's also delightful in its novelty. Even not considering skips or new routes to get to old places, the open experimental player is rewarded by playing the game. Take this narrow corridor that you must travel up instead of across. If you're still getting the hang of the controls, it's not a bad place to practice making quick and intuitive decisions about hammer movement and placement. If you have the game, just go bounce around this area and see if you can start to get more comfortable while hurtling over the chasm below you. It is the embrace of the chasm and the potential consequences of falling into it that makes getting over it, for me, a transcendental experience. The player must, through the experience of feeling their failures and learning from them, learn to narrow their focus to the exact moment they're in, thinking only a half step ahead. The game is most fun when the player's knowledge of it is so familiar as to have become almost ritualized, and yet the player remains open to bucking this ritual. It is what Esar calls a mutual contingency, in which both the text and reader are able to embrace the behaviors of each other and accommodate for any momentary reactions between the two. Toward the end of the game, Foddy says, "We have the same taste, you and I." It's not ambition, it's ambition's opposite, an obdurate mission to taste defeat. You'll feel bad if you win, so I put this snake in for you. I think this is essential to reading the game as a text, calling into question as it does the ideas of ambition and winning. It is a signal that you're playing a game not necessarily about winning, but about playing. Yes, it's very much about getting over it, that is the name of the game, but I think the primary game of this text isn't conquering the mountain. The primary game is, as I stated earlier, the exploration of frustration. And through this frustration, what we actually conquer is a small part of ourselves that recoils from frustration and failure, that refuses to examine it. It is a game where, through play, we come to recognize the personal utility of play itself. If you're listening to this, what's wrong with you? Come on, man. But really, thanks. It means a lot. This video was a lot more theoretical than the last one, and a little more theoretical than the next one. Speaking of that, the next video will be about the Amnesia games, and I can tell you now that there's going to be a little bit of history in it. You'll get to hear about the Council of Constance if you watch it. Anyway, you know what people say on this website. Like, comment, subscribe, Twitter, Twitch, Patreon below. With your help, we can keep fueling this discourse machine.